I'm now being joined by Arise International correspondent Adefemi Akinsoya, who has been covering the presidential elections in the United States, for an update as we begin to wind down on that event. Good morning, Adefemi. It's so lovely to have you join me this morning.
Good morning, Adesuwa. Good to hear your voice bright and early. How are you doing?
How is it going in Florida? And I'd like to know, how are the people of Florida responding to this election of Donald Trump? Of course, he's a resident there, so I'd like to know what's the vibe down there in Florida this morning?
Thank you, Adesuwa. So, as you said, yes, we're in West Palm Beach, Florida, in the Mar-a-Lago area, and definitely the energy here is far different. You'll know that over the course of the week, we have first started our coverage in America's Northeast, from New York City to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia therein, and then upwards to DC and Baltimore before coming south to Florida. And we are starting our journey in Florida in West Palm Beach, as I said, Mar-a-Lago area, and definitely the general consensus of people that we've met here is one of optimism, of excitement, of sheer happiness. Almost everyone we have spoken to so far has been a Trump supporter, and that cuts across a lot of different demographic lines. We're speaking to younger white voters who are staunchly behind Trump, especially young white men. Then we've also spoken to the older community. Don't forget that Florida is a retirement state, and so you do have an older section of the population here, and the general consensus among them, older, affluent white voters, is that they are very excited for a Trump presidency. We've got a great report coming up for you that shows you a huge mix of different levels of support at different areas when we are here in West Palm Beach, Florida, and other surrounding areas. It's on its way to you soon, and hopefully we'll be able to see what I'm talking about. But again, going back to what people have to say, older white voters, almost everyone we've spoken to says that they are very, very excited. And they are talking about how Donald Trump in this election has been able to address directly the needs of the American people. Before reproductive rights, before foreign policy, what the vast majority of Americans wanted to hear was a plan on the economy. And it seems as though, from what we're seeing in this election result, that it is Donald Trump that they believe is able to give them a clear pathway to that actuality. So again, this is a very affluent area, people who aren't immediately rubbing two pennies together in order to feed their families, but nevertheless they do care about taxation, they do care about business policy, they do care about having somebody who is sympathetic to those types of financial positions back in office. So that's definitely the energy that we're seeing on a general level here in West Palm Beach, Florida, in the Mar-a-Lago area, which is incredibly affluent. You know, there is definitely affluence all over the world. There's affluence definitely in Nigeria, in the United Kingdom, but just being over the bridge in Mar-a-Lago and seeing all of the different areas that we saw, that you will see in this report once it goes to air, it is quite eye-opening, and especially it does allow you to look at things critically. If these people are so focused on the economy, it does breed a different energy when it comes to what life is like in America, what life has been like over the last 4 years of a Biden presidency. And I do think that when we continue to go into different areas, less affluent areas, you may think that you'd find more apathy, more appetite for Kamala Harris or a Democratic candidate. And that really wasn't the case that we were seeing here. A lot of the less affluent people that we spoke to us very candidly and understood the harsh realities of this political situation. They do not care about what is going on internationally. They don't care about America's position in these wars. They don't care about what America has to do with the Middle East or what's going on in Ukraine. What they care about is being able to feed their families comfortably. What they care about is that their pensions and other contributions are going to be risen and higher and be worth more with this new president, so they believe. So it definitely does come together and understand that this is a vast country, and the more we are able to travel it, the more we can see that perhaps Donald Trump's victory, popular and electoral wise, wasn't that much of a surprise, definitely not in Florida.
Definitely. I think, what you said right now is reflecting the exit polls that we're seeing is that people care the most about the economy, they care the most about inflation, and they trusted Donald Trump with the economy. They said that he was a businessman, a successful businessman. But also, Donald Trump is of the demographic that you have in Florida. He is an old white man, and he's about to be America's oldest president ever at 78, and he is a very affluent man himself with his mansions over in Florida. So I think he is really at home there. But he has also kept busy this week. So beyond winning the election, I believe he selected a chief of staff, and he's had critical phone calls with certain world leaders. So can you give us some light on what Trump has been up to since victory?
Thank you, Adi. So yes, he has had a very, very interesting week. He did say that he had spoken to more than 70 world leaders today. I can imagine that those are definitely going to be calls of congratulations and calls of countries wanting to position themselves and align themselves in Donald Trump's good graces. Let's not also forget that we have heard reports that Elon Musk was also in attendance, was privy to one of the phone calls that went over into Ukraine. It's unclear at this moment what role he played in those phone calls, why he was there in the first place, what he could possibly have to contribute or to listen in on. And I do think that definitely underscores a lot of the concerns people might be feeling about who Trump is aligning himself with in this new administration. But definitely he has spent this first couple of days since that historic re-election speaking to different members of the party, the Republican Party, definitely speaking to different world leaders around the world, and then also focusing on how he can position this new cabinet, because there's a lot of Republican infighting, a lot of people on one hand wanting to position themselves so Donald Trump can give them a call, give them a tap to be welcomed into his administration, and then other people who perhaps have learned the hard way that a Trump administration, a Trump position in his government isn't always going to be the status quo, isn't going to be something that they are naturally aligned to as politicians. Finding out on television or finding out on social media that you've lost your job might be something that people don't want to put themselves in the position in once again. That being said, this week Donald Trump did make a historic pick for his chief of staff. He chose Susie Wiles. Susie Wiles is a veteran of Floridian politics, 67 years old, and is a huge, decades-long career in Republican strategy. She is no stranger to Donald Trump. She was involved in his 2016 campaign that delivered the state of Florida. And also, when we look at Governor Ron DeSantis in his 2018 election, he definitely leaned quite heavily on Susie Wiles for her expertise, for her knowledge and experience when it comes to understanding Florida as a state, as a polity, and trying to, of course, eventually successfully get that under his belt. They did have a falling out, Ron DeSantis and Susie Wiles, which led to her kind of being pushed out of the Trump fold. But clearly, as you can see, she was brought back in the 2020 campaign and once more again in this 2024 campaign. And I think it is in this latest campaign that Susie Wiles was really able to shine and show herself as a clear leader, someone who works and is very, very compatible with Donald Trump, someone who showed herself to be a loyal team member. And loyalty is definitely something that Donald Trump appreciates. If we cast our minds back to his last term in office, he would, as I said, get rid of people, fire them. It's something that he definitely prioritizes. So when he feels as though there's a turning away from him, a shifting of allegiance, he is likely to kick out and get rid of those person, badmouth them, talk down about them. Look at what he has said about Mike Pence over the last couple of years, just to underscore that type of point. But going back to Susie Wiles, it will be very interesting to see what her leadership will look like in the White House. It is a historic appointment. She will be the first woman in U.S. history to be a chief of staff to a sitting U.S. president. So definitely something that again goes against criticisms that people may have had about Donald Trump and whether or not he will platform women in his administration. He did have a lot of women on his team the first time around, and definitely, as we can see from this appointment of Susie Wiles, it is something that he is definitely going, or at least clearly debilitating with, definitely debating with, when we keep our eyes open for whatever appointments are coming down the way. This is also a president who is going to be coming into office with a different trail behind him. He has had significant legal issues, and even though he has had significant legal wins, such as the fact that now he is now definitely going to be president again, it's unlikely that he will have the considerable amount of number of illegal issues that he had when he wasn't in office. So he's definitely been able to circumvent a lot of the legal blowback that would have hurt him had he not won this election. We did hear Adam Kevin Smith has been trying to get on a phone call with Donald Trump and his team members to drop different cases, to talk to him about different type of settlements. So you can see that the legal landscape around Donald Trump is definitely changing. It will be interesting to hear as well who his Attorney General would be, whether or not that would be somebody who stands quite independent and follows the law when it comes to delivering their job, or whether or not this will be someone that also aligns with Trump, someone that Trump can find some trust in. It is all happening at this time, but we will keep our eyes and ears open on who this time Trump will align himself with. What lessons has he learned the first time? Even going back to his pick of Chief of Staff, you know, Adesua, that he had 4 different ones during his first term, and he announced 2 at the same time, if you remember. So it does seem as though, even though he is not the quintessential politician by any stretch of the imagination, it does seem as though he is taking his footsteps, biding his time peacefully. He is here in Mar-a-Lago. We haven't seen him yet. I keep on telling you that I think Donald Trump is a huge fan of Arise News, but he's yet to come out and speak to us directly. Hopefully that will happen before we leave West Palm Beach, Florida. But again, it is a very, very busy time for him. On the one hand, he's definitely celebrating and kicking back and preparing for this new lease of life. But I can imagine that when it comes to picking his team, picking his cabinet, it's very difficult decisions ahead, Adesua.
Well, Femi, you're absolutely right there. And I do hope you get to run into the Donald Trump himself before you leave Mar-a-Lago, but also bringing it home a bit because, you know, we are talking about the U.S. elections, but we haven't had a same party transition in America since Reagan-Bush, where the Republicans were able to go from Reagan to Bush. But now, you know, I want to say, what lessons can Nigerians probably take from these elections? Do we see this as a repudiation of liberal values, or was it a repudiation of the Biden-Harris administration? Where did Kamala Harris go wrong? You know, is it her policies, which seem to have, you know, abortion, for example, has been entrenched in the constitutions of 7 states out of 10, Florida being one of the states that it was not able to pass, but it still got 57% of the vote, where Kamala Harris only got 43% of the vote. So do you think this has a lot to do with her policies, or do you think, as you said, it has to do with the economy? And you know, in Nigeria, we did have a lot of people vote against the APC, but because of the split ticket, because of the 3 candidates, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu was still able to emerge the least popular president that we've seen in terms of vote share in Nigeria. So where do you think Kamala went wrong? And also, you know, bringing it home, what do you think Nigerians can take from this?
Let's start with where Kamala went wrong. I do think that this was firstly an issue of time. And sometimes when you're looking at this election result hypocritically, or rather critically, you can sound quite hypocritical, because had she won, the narrative would be completely different. Oh, you know, even though she had a short runway when it comes to this campaign, she was still able to deliver what the people want. America has the appetite for it. It just didn't translate. So if we look at specifically where Kamala Harris went wrong, if we start at the very beginning, she didn't have the time to prepare a successful campaign. That's not to say that the campaign that she ran with wasn't a good one, because it was fantastic. She was able to rally a lot of Democrats. She was able to crowdsource and have a lot of funding, a lot of financial backing. She did have a lot of Democratic support. However, clearly that didn't translate into the ballot boxes. So firstly, she didn't have the time. And when you go back to Nancy Pelosi and her involvement in getting rid of Joe Biden, forcing him to step down, had that happened sooner, had there been the space and time for a Democratic primary, perhaps then the general public would have had more access, more ability to vet these candidates and understand where the distinction is from Joe Biden currently to these people before them. That's just not something that happened. What we saw was a seemingly coronation of Kamala Harris, and everyone really just focused their attention in trying to get her into office. And unfortunately, that just didn't translate well, especially since even if people have been lifelong Democrat voters, people who are undecided, who are open to the idea of voting for a Democrat again, clearly wanted to have some understanding of what the disparities are between a Kamala Harris presidency and what is currently the status quo under Joe Biden. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to communicate that effectively enough. We cast our minds back to that interview she had on The View, where she was asked how she is different from Joe Biden. And unfortunately, she just couldn't answer. Immediately after that interview, her team came out to try and clear things up. But I do think in that sense, the damage was already done. That's one issue. That being said, also, as much as we can talk about the development of America, the diversity in, this is also a staunchly conservative country, just like Nigeria. I'm coming to Nigeria in just a moment. And when we talk about women in positions of power, clearly there just isn't that type of appetite just yet. Donald Trump had already been president once before. The people of America know what a presidency under Donald Trump would look like, would sound like, would feel like. They had no idea what a presidency under Kamala Harris would be like. But seemingly, if we look at the polls, they just didn't care. I don't think they cared, were interested in making any type of history in electing the first woman or the first woman of color into office. That wasn't their priority. I don't think people cared about her as a candidate. I don't think she was able to resonate with enough people. Unfortunately, if you ask people on the street a few days ago before they went to the polls in person on Tuesday, what do you think about Donald Trump? Why would you vote for him? They would tell you, I care about business. He cares about business. I want to lower taxes. He's going to lower taxes. I want to protect my tips. He's going to protect my tips. He's going to make it easier for me to feed myself. He's going to make it easier for me to feed my families. And when it comes to those clear, individualized policies, I don't think people had that same type of social contract with Kamala Harris or the Biden administration. So that's where she faltered, and it was quite disappointing. Definitely when we were in Washington, D.C. and in the Northeast, a lot of people that we spoke to were very sympathetic to Kamala Harris, were behind her, were voting for her, but were unsure if she was going to be able to deliver the presidency. And unfortunately, she was unable to do so. And that is, of course, happening against the backdrop of so much noise, so much endorsement, so much campaigns, so many celebrities coming out to support her. So naturally, you can get drowned in that noise and think that she's going to go on and win on a landslide. And that's just not what happens, which brings me to Nigerian state of politics. We cast our minds back to 2023, and it was very much the same type of energy on social media. Younger Nigerian voters, first-time Nigerian voters, throwing their weight behind the Labour Party, behind the Labour Party's candidate, saying that this is going to be the person who's going to facilitate change. It's going to be him, especially after hearing that he took Lagos in at the presidential level. He is definitely going to sweep to victory, and that didn't translate when we look at the polls. The APC were able to return. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is the president, and while, as you've said, he is not the most popular at this moment, he was still able to secure enough votes in order to be in office, go from one APC candidate, one APC president to yet another. And so I do think that that's what we're seeing here all over the world. Sometimes a lot of the noise that we hear in the run-up to elections, especially on social media, it doesn't always translate, because what you see on television, what you see on your timelines, on Twitter, on Instagram, it just isn't the everyday reality of people who are on the ground. That's how President Tinubu was able to be put back into office despite so much rejection of an APC presidency. And clearly that's what we're seeing here, the rejection of a democratic presidency yet again, despite the stakes, despite the fact that there is legitimate concerns over what plans Donald Trump has for the state of immigration here. This is Florida. Specifically, it's quite racially diverse. Because of its geographic location, there's a huge Latin community here. And even though Latin men voted for Trump in their troves, there's definitely going to be legitimate concerns on who people are going to rely on, what type of reality people are going to be facing. People who have just gotten their papers here in America over the last 4 years under the Biden administration, are they going to be quote unquote safe? What happens to the future? Is Trump and the Trump administration, are they going to remove birthright citizenship for people who are not American parents? There's so many questions when it comes to what this reality is going to look like. But that being said, even though there are confusion over what mass deportation is going to look like under this new administration, even though reproductive rights and women's health have been repealed continually over the last couple of years during Trump's last administration, and clearly going to be the case as he comes back into office, it just seems as though all of those legitimate societal issues just fell by the wayside, because everyone was focused on the economy. Everyone was focused on their immediate needs. And it seems as though, for many people at least, Donald Trump is the person who they think was going to do that far better than Kamala Harris. And then finally, actually, just one other thing. I think another thing that perhaps Nigerian politicians can learn from this election is, no matter how bitter the defeat is, there is many things that can be said about the grace that is calling your political opponent and congratulating them. There is grace in understanding that an election can end with you conceding. in front of your supporters instead of every election ending in the courtroom. I think that could be one lesson for many politicians in Nigeria and of course around the world too.
Yes, I do agree with you there, but I do say that in Nigeria we have the little issue of trust. Low trust in the system, low trust in INEC, even sometimes low trust in the judiciary. And so maybe that is why the grace does not exist as it does, where people can see their votes being counted and believe in the process. But I have a request for you, Adefemi. I'm not going to lie. I need you to bring a little snack for me there from Florida, because you have mentioned the Latino community in Florida, but the Latino community in Florida is very different from the one where I grew up in North Carolina. Where in North Carolina they're mostly Mexican Latinos, but in Florida it's mostly Cuban, and the Cubans are Republican through and have always been. But I want to ask you actually, going forward, particularly because we're talking about the economy, and we've seen that since COVID, every single government that was in power in the developed world during COVID has lost voter share because of the economy, because of inflation. In fact, America's inflation rate, thanks to Biden, is actually the lowest amongst the G7 countries. However, it is still significant. And at the end of the day, people care about their food, the ability to afford their basic, amenities and life. And in Nigeria, that's something that we're dealing with now. We're dealing with higher food inflation, and we're being told that by Africa Exchange that in 2025 we're going to have historically high levels of food inflation. We're being told that maybe 30 million Nigerians will not be able to afford food next year, just 2025. And so, when you're going around as our international correspondent, we've been able to enjoy some of these experiences together. What lessons do you think can be drawn for Nigeria, particularly around the economy moving forward?
I think one of the greatest lessons that can be learned internationally when it comes to an election, when it comes to people showing what their appetite looks like for leadership, is definitely going to be one that many people will learn from in this election, understanding the relationship between people and their harsh set of economic realities. If we cast our minds back to 2020, and then of course these years since then, it's only been 4 years since this huge pandemic came and really shifted a lot of things. Many people are still reeling from not only the economic fallout from the pandemic, but also the social fallout. There are many people who are still, of course, mourning the loss of family members, mourning jobs that went, a different type of work situation where people can no longer or don't work in the same ways that they did beforehand. And there aren't people who have been able to shift themselves in order to reap the benefits of this new world. And I think that when you're looking at politics, when you're looking at elections, people, traditionally speaking, have always blamed whatever government is in power for whatever their circumstances are. So if you are currently struggling in whatever country you are in, if you are struggling economically, if you're struggling financially, if you've lost your job, if you've lost your healthcare, if the quality of your life has reduced significantly, you are naturally going to blame the government in power for it, whether or not they're a government that you voted for beforehand or after. That is something that we see all over the world, a rejection and a blaming of who is responsible for my individual life. So to that extent, you can't really be surprised by the outcome of this election. That being said, there's also an understanding people have that leadership can only do what it can with the set of circumstances before them. So here we have people who are talking about, okay, the economy is something that is very important to me. I want to be able to have more income at the end of the day. I want to be able to make sure that my dollar stretches. Naturally, you would think that perhaps a democratic leadership would be able to do that for you, but clearly that hasn't computed. When we spoke to people who constitute the working class in this area of West Palm Beach, even though generally it is quite affluent, when you go to areas like North Palm Beach, people aren't as affluent. People refer to themselves as poor, as you will hear in our report. And they talked about how when it comes to the leadership, they didn't actually feel as though the Democrats cared about addressing them. They talked about how Joe Biden, and I'm quoting a lady from the report here, she said that he gave too much, he did too much with handouts, and we didn't want to receive handouts. What we wanted to receive was this support so that we can look after ourselves. So an example of that, or perhaps the fable behind that type of saying is, don't give us fish, teach us how to fish. And I think that when it comes to leadership, they believe that it is Donald Trump who's going to deliver that type of apparatus for them to stand up on their own 2 feet, because you'll know better than anybody, America is a country that doesn't really pride itself on social welfare. Of course, there is definitely social welfare systems, but it does seem as though when it comes to this country and the leadership therein and people's aspirations, this American dream of being able to build yourself up, of being able to accrue and invest in yourself in order to deliver whatever version of the dream means for you, is important to people. And when you speak to people who aren't in the most stronger financial positions, they just do feel quite let down by the Democrats, do feel quite let down by a presidency that didn't do enough for them over these 4 years to address their immediate concerns when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to them wanting to be able to stand up on their own 2 feet. That being said, if you compare the United States to a country like the United Kingdom, who has obviously had its own shift in leadership over the past few months, we do know that, well, America has gone from having the Democrats in power to now a Republican leadership come 2020-25. In the United Kingdom, it was the inverse of that. We had the Conservatives in power for 14 years, and that clearly go and be no longer the case with this latest election, with Labour being able to come back into power and use their more socially sympathetic policies to address the needs of the people. Because if people are talking about the cost of living, the economy in the United Kingdom, how public services aren't working, naturally you would think that it is a leadership that comes from the Labour Party that would deliver those issues. But we're seeing that in inverse here. So it is quite difficult, I think, for people to understand what it is that they think. Yes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was saying I completely agree with you. The cost of living crisis we're seeing in the UK has resulted in maybe a leftward shift, but also the Labour Party might have been lucky there that the Reform Party helped slash down the Conservative vote. But in America, we're seeing some move to the right, even with Gen Z, which usually the youth are the liberal folk. But Adefemi, I'm so happy I was able to speak to you this morning.
While we were stood. Before you go, and I'm so happy you mentioned the Gen Z, because when we were on the bridge of Mar-a-Lago, just overlooking the waters back into the Trump campaign, we did have very young men, they couldn't have been older than 25, ride past on their bicycles, scream obscenities and say that they were happy that a woman is not in power, they're happy that Trump has won, and says essentially down with the women. So that just underscores what you've just said, that even when it comes to younger voters, there is a huge shift behind the Republican Party, a huge shift to the right. So, I mean, very, very interesting times ahead, Adesua.
Yeah, I'm absolutely frightened. I think it's a 30-point shift to the right for young men and young white men. Even in my previous university, they're sending out letters right now to the black students who are being taunted and haunted with racial slurs. So I'm afraid about what we're going to see in the next 4 years of a Trump presidency. But I miss you, Adefemi, and I'm so happy that we've been able to discuss the elections and round out, and I can't wait to see your report. Thank you for joining me this morning.